Well, thank you for that introduction, Melvin, and in particular, thank you for the invitation to talk to the Information Physics Institute about my theory of emergent information. What to expect? In the next 45 minutes ago, I have a presentation for you, which starts with an introduction of myself. And that's not so much out of vanity, but because by doing so, I can also explain where the theory comes from, how it developed in the course of the years gone by. After that, I'll give you a quick elevator pitch of the theory to set the scene, to make clear what it is that I'm actually trying to convince you of. After which I'll take a deeper look into emergent information theory, the rationale behind it, and how it should work. Don't expect much maths and algebra, because this is more a conceptual presentation than a technical one. There are more pictures. And finally, at the end, I'm hoping for a discussion in which perhaps you can tell me why I'm wrong, or at least how the theory could be improved upon, because basically that's how science works, or perhaps even what you like about the theory. To start with myself, this is me back in 1981 with my friends from university. I studied biology at York in the UK, and I chose biology because I was fascinated by the complexity of living organisms, and I wanted to learn more about it. And at York, I certainly learned a lot more about that complexity, in any case, in a mechanistic sense of the word, such as how information in the genome is transcribed into polypeptide sequences. And the implicit message here was that this was the explanation for the complexity of living organisms, that the genome determines what happens, what is created in that respect. And it was here that I encountered my first problem, and that was in understanding how 23 chromosomes, just 20,000 genes in the human genome, could explain the full complexity of the human body in all its aspects. That 20,000 is simply quantitatively not enough, even if it was the right kind of information, which it isn't. It's just coding polypeptide sequences. It's not defining bones or organs or any of the rest of the stuff which is involved in creating a functional multicellular organism. So I left university a little disappointed in that respect. I emigrated to Holland, took up a career in IT, and in the train on the way to work in the morning and on the way home in the evenings, I kept reading about the developments in the various areas which interested me, and in particular, complexity theory, emergence, and self-organization as more advanced explanations for the formation and function of multicellular organisms. And where genetic determinism really fell apart for me was when I started reading about the connectome, the incredible complexity of connectivity within the brains of humans and even lesser animals like the fruit fly, where in order to define these structures from the microscopic to the macroscopic level, there is quantitatively orders of magnitude greater detail than could ever be explained in terms of genetic information. And then I bumped into David Chalmers and his hard problem of consciousness, in which he says basically, quite apart from explaining the entire formation and structure of the brain, even if you were to do that, right down to the level of the synapse and the neurotransmitters which underlie its function, there would still be something missing. You still would not be able to explain the phenomenon of consciousness. That for that, we need something that goes beyond materialism. And if the hard problem wasn't bad enough, it turned into a harder problem, and I continued to read and found out that, in fact, throughout the course of human history, there have been any number of theories about the relationship between the mind and the body, the soul, and that to this day, there is no consensus on this matter, that they're instead a number of theories which often are completely contradictory to each other. And that while, in fact, there is only one reality, so there must be only one answer to this question. Shortly after that, I stumbled into Thomas Kuhn and his structure of scientific revolutions, and it struck me that this is a classic situation that he was talking about, where there are a number of conflicting situations with which need to be brought together somehow under a new paradigm. And I was wondering, is one of the theories which I'd read about that paradigm which could solve this problem, or is a new paradigm necessary? And of the things, the theories which I'd read about, I didn't really find any one which met this condition. And that was why I started to think for myself, perhaps a new paradigm is required to solve this problem. What happened in 2013? I was walking on my way to work out of Amsterdam Zuid station, coming out of this tunnel, when it occurred to me that possibly I could combine what I've been learning about emergence and complexity with what I was finding out about information in my day job in IT, and that could possibly lead to a new solution to this problem. And in the years that followed, in the train, on the way to work and on the way home, rather than reading, I got to writing to flesh out this idea which I'd had in 2013. And that ended up as this book, getting on for 600 pages, which I had printed a couple of copies just for family and friends before thinking, what a waste of all that effort if it doesn't go any further. So I contacted a number of publishers to find out if they'd be interested in publishing the book. And of course, most of them just gave me a flat turn down. But Routledge said that they were interested in the idea, but I had to realize that without ever even having published in a scientific journal, a peer-reviewed journal, and without a scientific affiliation, they couldn't take the risk. So in the years that followed, in the train, on the way to work and on the way home, I got to writing articles, which were again, obviously, in the first instance, rejected by peer-reviewed journals. But finally, in 2020, January, an article was accepted in interdisciplinary science reviews and published. And from that followed a review article in Research Outreach. And from that followed an invitation from the International Society for the Study of Information to give a presentation at their 2021 Congress. From that, of course, I got an article in the Proceedings and a spin-off article in New Explorations. And with this portfolio under my arm, I went back to Routledge and I said, do you remember me from a few years back? I've done what you said. I've published in peer-reviewed journals, and perhaps now you're interested in publishing my book. Now, to my great surprise, they said yes. And so the next couple of years were spent writing the book, rewriting the book, in fact, because what turned out was that when I went back to the book that I'd written back in 2015, my ideas had progressed in such a way that I could start again. Anyway, September this year, finally, Existing in the Information Dimension was published by Routledge. If this talk whets your appetite to learn more about it, to hear the full story, then I can recommend that you try and get your hands on a copy. But enough of the sales pitch. How about the elevator pitch? What is that 2 + 2 is something new? To understand this, it's very important to define clearly what I actually mean by emergence and by information, because both terms are used in very many different ways. And if you use another definition of either of these terms, then basically the theory doesn't work. The emergence I'm talking about here is that which forms the basis of everything basically in physical reality, that ultimately it's all based on subatomic particles fundamental particles, quarks, which combine in huge numbers to form a sequential stack of levels of organization, where each level of organization has its own properties which do not exist in the underlying layers. In this example, if that matter that you can see there, if that's water, it has wetness as a property, as a characteristic, which doesn't exist in molecules of H2O or the atoms or the quarks that underlie it. So it's that very simple type of functional emergence, you could say. The information I'm talking about is slightly more difficult to define, and the easiest way that I find of explaining that is to take the example of the bit in the computer. A physical bit, a magnetic orientation or whatever, is associated with a binary value. And that binary value, that is the kind of information that I'm talking about. And the idea was, what if you combine those binary values together, just like you combine quarks together, and that large numbers of them are structured then in stacked layers of organization, where again, each layer of organization has its own properties that do not exist in the underlying layer. Now, anybody who has the least understanding of computers will understand that that is exactly how they work. And that this is anything but radical, really. I mean, we combine binary values to bytes, bytes to machine code, and so forth, all the way up to the top level where we find the functionality which we need out of our computers and the programs that we build into them. To make that visual, you can see that, in fact, it's very comparable to what we see in the physical organization of matter, that there are a number of layers of organization, starting with the binary values, and ultimately they culminate in an application like the PowerPoint application I'm using to make this presentation. With a very big difference, and that is that while the binary values are associated with physical states, that which is built from them is actually non-detectable. And the reason why it's non-detectable is because it's not made of matter and energy, and perhaps more significantly, it exists outside of physical space. This may seem a bit odd to think about computers this way. After all, I mean, computers are surely physical things. We build them in factories in much the same way as we build a car. But there's a very significant difference, and that is this physical aspect of the computer is not actually where its functionality is. When the car rolls off the production line, all you need to do is put petrol in the tank and it'll drive. When the computer rolls off the production line, it can do absolutely nothing without software. And this is where the significant difference about information technologies from physical technologies becomes apparent. That on the left-hand side here, you see a hardware engineer who needs to know everything about electronics and how you put components together to get a particular functionality. He doesn't need to know anything about software. On the right-hand side, you see a software engineer who needs to know everything about the logic of programming languages and whatever, but doesn't actually need to know anything about how the computer works as an electronic device. And these two worlds are connected but distinct. And my claim is that what we see in the physical realm, this computer which sits on our desk, is actually only an interface to the information dimension. The keyboard is an input interface in which we can send things through to the information to get them done. And the monitor is an output interface where we can see what has happened in there. So what we see here is, in fact, that these two interconnected worlds, on both sides, there is this same kind of functional emergence where parts are brought together in order to create a function which does not exist in any of the individual parts. On the hardware side, that's also the case. Just a power supply or a keyboard or a processor or something will not do anything on its own. It's only when they're all brought together to form a functioning computer that they're any use to us. And the same thing on the information dimension side, simply having bits randomly wandering around won't help us at all unless they are constructed together in a very specific way that is required to create, again, in this case, the PowerPoint software. And it struck me that, in fact, this is very comparable to what we see in brains, where there is also a complexity, there's a large number of physical units interacting together in the physical realm. And on the information dimension side, we have a phenomenon such as, in this case, the perception of a red rose. And in fact, that whether we're talking about evolved biological or designed technological systems, all systems with an informational function based on a physical substrate are actually this type of interface between two worlds, two dimensions. So much for the elevator pitch. For you to accept this new idea, I guess more explanation is required. So I'd like to get back to basics with a white and a black circle. These are two physical entities, if you like, with physical properties. They have a size, a shape, a color, and all of these things are observable physical characteristics. If they were bit states in a computer, they could be associated with binary values, 0 or 1 in this respect. And the important thing here is that while the physical properties are detectable, the binary values are not. Again, this may seem a little odd because we find it so easy to work with computers, but to demonstrate the fact, I only need to ask this question: which of these bits is associated with the binary 1? Without going back to the previous slide, you can't tell me because there's no way to do so without knowing what coding system is being used. And in fact, that is quite arbitrary. It could be that white is 0 and black is 1. It could be the other way around. It could be a completely different physical characteristic, such as a magnetic orientation. The fact is that the detectable physical properties actually have no functional value. The function is based on the binary values, which are non-detectable. And at the bit level, this may not be so particularly radical or whatever, because there's a one-to-one relationship. But in order to get to anything useful, we have already seen, we need to stack layers of organization of these individual bit values a number of times. And the first level of that is generally the byte, the 8-bit sequence, which is associated with a sequence of binary values. And those binary values are then indeed combined to form something which cannot exist at the bit state level, the binary level. And here again, or even more so, we see the difficulty in determining what the information actually is, because what is the decimal value of this byte? Unless you know what coding system is used, you won't be able to tell me. And to give an example of how arbitrary this is, here we see four different examples of the information that could be coded in exactly the same bit sequence. On the top, we see the situation where the black is associated with 1 and white is associated with 0. On the bottom, the other way around. On the left-hand side, we see a system which reads from left to right. On the right-hand side, from right to left. And these are just two of any number of arbitrary coding systems which you could think up and use. Another way in which the distinction between the physical and the informational becomes apparent is if you think about how a hard disk works, and that is it has sequential tracks over which, in general, information is fragmentally stored. And this means that bit states which are next to each other may actually have nothing to do with each other, while bit states which are on the other side of the disk may actually be functional neighbors. So here you see that, in fact, the topology of the physical substrate is entirely different to the topology of the information that it stores. In this example, we're not just talking about a linear sequence even of information, but a multidimensional relational database, which can be stored in this way on a hard disk, where there is no relation whatsoever between the shape, the topology, the dimensionality of the physical substrate on the one hand, and the information stored on another. So in conclusion, when we look at functional computers, emergence in computers, we see they do indeed exhibit this sequential stacked levels of organization with an increasing distance from the detectable physical states, which we can actually see in the computer. That all of this is not locatable in physical space, and it has a non-physical structure and function. This being the case, how is it possible that computers are so easy to treat as mechanical objects, machines? And the answer to that is that we designed them, and we designed them in that way to make them transparent. In between the storage, which we see on a hard disk, and the monitor, we have processors which know how that coding has been done and can therefore deconstruct the bit coding and reconstruct it as a pixel coding so that we can actually see on the screen what it is that is stored in the information dimension created by the computer. So this is actually, it's an illusion of detectability. What we see on the screen, those points of the pixel, obviously don't correspond to the bits on the hard disk. They don't even respond to the information which is stored on them. It is purely a visual reconstruction for our purposes of being able to see into the information dimension of the computer. And it then struck me that this is actually very similar to what happens in the brain, that what is actually happening in the brain functionally, in this case, the intention to say hello to somebody, is undetectable. But between that intention and the outside world, the physical world, we have a motor cortex which can convert that intention into muscular activity in the vocal cords, which will cause somebody to say hello. In that way, we have some kind of window into the information dimension created by the human brain. And here, even more than in the case of the computer, we see that physical proximity is not the same as functional proximity. Particularly in a small world network, as we see in the brain's connectome, it can be the case that nodes, cells at a distance are connected, while those right next to each other are in fact have nothing to do with each other, are not connected. And if you look at network topologies, this tells us some interesting things. That is that here again we see that that space and volume on the physical side is very different to that actually in the network. On the left-hand side, you see a four-dimensional cube, a tesseract, as it can be projected onto 2 dimensions. On the right-hand side, you see a network which is exactly the same as on the left-hand side. So it still actually contains that tesseract. It's just that you can't see it because it has been jumbled. And what is particularly interesting here is that if the length of a side of the tesseract is 2, then the four-dimensional volume is actually 16, and the area of that four-dimensional cube is 64. Whereas on the right-hand side, if that's a flat network, it actually has a volume of 0 and an area of just 16. So it shows that in a network, you actually can create a greater volume than exists in the network itself. So if we bring these two together, we see that in fact, computers and brains are far more comparable in this respect than we might usually think, that they are based on a physical substrate from which units, the fundamental units of information combine into multiple levels of organization in the information dimension up to the top level, which is what we ultimately see and work with. The big difference is that in computers, because they're designed that way, we can actually deduce and reconstruct all of these intermediate levels if we want to do so. In fact, that's necessary because that's the only way that we can build them. On the right-hand side in the brain, unfortunately, because they are not coded systems, these intermediate levels cannot be detected. And for that reason, the illusion can exist that all that exists is that highlighted rows at the end of the story, rather than also all of the required layers of organization underneath it to bridge that immense gap from anything at the level of the cell, which could exist as information, and something of the complexity and the richness of a perceptual experience. So paraphrasing Chalmers a little here in respect to the hard problem, what we can also say is that it's not just applicable to brains and consciousness. We can equally say, even when we have explained the performance of all of the electronic processes taking place in a computer, there will still be an unanswered question: how and why is the performance of these functions accompanied by the PowerPoint presentation? In the case of the computer, the answer is actually fairly easy, and that is why? Well, because that's what we build them for. Those are the required information functions which we build into them. And how they do it is also fairly easy to answer. That's on the basis of code-based design. In the case of the brain, the why question is actually also fairly easy to answer, and that is because there is a necessity for all living organisms to exhibit responsive behavior, and that requires complex processing of sensory information to generate directed action. The how question is a lot more difficult to answer because that is basically organic self-organization, which is, as I learned in my train journeys on the way to the work every morning, is one of the more difficult things to fathom. What I, of course, am not claiming is that the PowerPoint presentation is in any way consciousness. Consciousness is just one of the many different emergent phenomena that can arise within the information dimension with very different characteristics. Just as our brains do not produce slideshows, the PowerPoint presentation does not produce qualia. So, in both cases, we are talking about non-physical substances, high-level phenomena, and both of them existing in the information dimension. So on the nature of consciousness, I have a message for the philosophers, which is perhaps a disappointment, that consciousness is not unique and is not fundamental, which is often claimed that it could be in some way non-divisible. I'm saying it's very divisible. It's just that the parts which consciousness is made of are themselves invisible to us, and therefore we can assume that they do not exist. But as I said before, bridging the gap between the neuron and conscious experience, in my view, necessitates a number of intermediate levels. There's also a message for the materialists, and that will please, no doubt, Chalmers, and that is that there is indeed more to reality than the physical. So going back to Chalmers, I would like to expand his statement by saying that materialism may be a beautiful and compelling view of the world, but not just to account for consciousness, but in fact, for all technological and biological information systems, we have to go beyond materialism. So much for the logical reasoning, but how does this work then? And this is one of the things which I struggled with for some time. Fair enough. So we have these fundamental units of information or something which get combined, stacked up to produce these higher level phenomena with their own properties. But what are they then? And where do they come from? My conclusion was that, in fact, every physical interaction creates this kind of information. So in this case, when the black square is influenced by some cause to turn into a white square, that cause is actually associated with the white circle, sorry, and attached to it as information about the fact that it is the cause of its changing from black to white. Now, in a physical system, this is really completely irrelevant, because a physical system can only ever act on the basis of the current state. So when the white circle goes on to interact with something else, it does so simply as a white circle. The fact that it was once a black circle and that something caused it to go white, that has no effect whatsoever. And the fundamental difference with an information system is that that is not the case. What happens after this interaction is not determined by the whiteness of the circle, but by the information about the cause of that whiteness, which is associated with it. And a consequence of this state of affairs is that everything in the universe basically works like a physical system. It can only ever go on, perform its actions in a way which is consistent with its current state, except for systems which have specifically evolved or been designed to exploit this information in this way. A very simple example of this in biological systems is insulin. We've got a number of messenger molecules, hormones in both animals and plants, which work in this way, that something is detected, in this case, high blood sugar, and that leads to the release of a messenger molecule, in this case, insulin, which carries the information that there is high blood sugar to a receptor somewhere where it has an effect of causing sugar uptake. In this case, what we see is that it's clearly the information associated with the insulin and not the actual form of the insulin molecule itself, which causes the effect. We could replace the insulin with any other molecule we liked, as long as the insulin receptor recognizes it as representing high blood sugar. Now, in this case, again, we could say, so what? With this one-to-one relationship between a physical substrate and the information it carries, it's quite easy to just say the two are the same kind of thing. It's not really important. It's not really necessary to consider it as anything more. But then evolution came up with the neuron. And neurons are interesting in a number of ways. For a start, they are generic, and that is very different than hormones, because a neuron can actually carry any information depending on what it detects and what it's connected to. You don't need a different kind of neuron to, for instance, transfer sound information rather than visual information. They're very efficient because they're point to point. So they just send a message from one part of the body to another. Hormones have to spread through the bloodstream, so they're inherently less efficient. They're fast. They don't have to wait for blood to be pumped around the body. They can act in milliseconds. And as I said before, they're directed over distance, so they can actually accurately create a response in another part of the body to where the information is detected. But most importantly, they are connectable. And this is what happens in brains and in ganglia and other collections of neurons in biological organisms, is that they are brought together, and this connectivity allows their information associated with them to be combined in the way that is necessary to create higher level informational phenomenon. This same kind of situation we can see in information technologies, that long ago the abacus was invented. The abacus is a bit like a hormone in the sense that it only does very simple things with information. A bead can be associated with the numerical value of 1 or 10. Okay, this is arbitrary. You could, again, read from left to right, right to left. You could use it in all sorts of different ways. But what it can do is actually very simple and straightforward. And again, here, yeah, there's no real necessity to make things more difficult. Where this changed was when Alan Turing blessed us with the concept of the universal Turing machine, which he proved could actually perform any algorithmic function, where an algorithm is basically an information process. And in the first instance, what perhaps wasn't eminently clear, but which took place in the decades following the invention and also the creation of the first Turing machines, was that it allows the creation of high-level languages. That's not inherent in the basic function of the Turing machine, but it makes it possible. And perhaps most noticeable, if you compare a Turing machine with any other machine, like a washing machine or anything else which we create, the Turing machine performs no physical function. If you were to open your front door and find this on the doorstep, you'd probably be very puzzled to think, what on earth is this for? What can I do with this machine? It doesn't seem to have any kind of function at all. And that was the brilliance of Turing, really, that he realized that using these physical mechanisms, we could actually create high-level information processing possibilities, endless possibilities, even. Going back to basics again. So what is this information? On the one hand, we have physical entities, bits and neurons, neuron states, synapses, neurotransmitters, physical properties which can be detected. On the other, we have informational entities with informational properties, which are completely different to the properties of the substrate they are based on. In the case of the bit, in any case, in computers, it's clear that that is an indivisible unit. You can't break down a binary value into something less than a binary value. And in the case of neurons, it's a bit of the question, will that be something associated with a synapse or with a neural state or with a neurotransmitter? But at some level, and it's a macroscopic level, there will be a fundamental unit of information. This fundamental nature leads me to consider these units of information as a kind of information quark, or if you like, an I quark, or the term which I kind of struggled with because it sounds a little tongue-in-cheek, is quirk. And then I realized that, in fact, yeah, these things are fairly quirky in that respect. They're not the kind of objects, the kind of entities which we're used to thinking about as objects, and therefore I think the term quirk is actually fairly appropriate in this respect. Now, the property dualists here will say, seriously, are you really considering that a binary value deserves this status of being considered as an independent entity? And as a substance dualist, I say most definitely yes, and for the reasons which I've described up to now, that it doesn't stop at this level. This is only the start of something great. And in that respect, it's important also to make a distinction between my substance dualism or substance dualism in emergent information system and Cartesian dualism. And not really because they are particularly different, because Cartesian dualism, I guess, paved the way, or at least in any case, everything which philosophers for centuries have been doing in refusing to accept consciousness as being a material phenomenon, they paved the way for this. But this is only the tip of the iceberg, because my dualism applies just as much to the binary value associated with an individual bit in a computer as it does to the high levels of consciousness which we see associated with the human brain. So where this brings us to is perhaps a new form, a new concept of information physics, because as we have seen, inside this information dimension, there are processes taking place, there are interactions taking place, there is combination of entities taking place, which must actually follow its own physics in order to exhibit consistent action and in order to be able to be used in the way that it is to create useful functions. And that in the information dimension, any diversity of different kinds of things can be created on the basis of those same fundamental units of information. On the computer side, that can be as diverse as the PowerPoint program I used for this presentation, a digital image of a Christmas tree, a text, the text of my book perhaps, or indeed a relational database. And on the brain side of things, that can be anything from an emotion, from a perceptual sensation such as seeing a red rose, our plans for the future, or even something as crazy as emergent information theory. And of course, on the brain side, there's a whole additional dimension to this relative to on the computer side, and that is the subconscious. So that is everything which goes on inside the information dimension created by your brain, to which you have no conscious access. Because you don't have conscious access to it to yourself, you can't express that to anybody else. So nobody else also has access to everything which is going on there, in spite of the fact that we know it is there, because sometimes our behavior is based on these subconscious processes. But more importantly, the things which we can see consciously and report on, they need these intermediate levels of organization in order to bridge the immense gap down to the level of fundamental information particles. And it doesn't stop with the individual. Characteristic of humans is our use of symbolic language, as I am doing now, to transfer information between my information dimension and yours. This is something we do on a daily basis. Other animals also communicate to some extent, also transfer information between their information dimensions, but the degree to which humans do this is unparalleled in the animal kingdom, and can lead to interesting higher level effects above the level of the individual, which could not exist in the individual itself. This is a simple example of that, and that is self-organizing echo chambers in social media, that when you get people communicating together in a random fashion in the first instance, that will actually lead to a clustering on the basis of similar ideas, similar or points of view on life or whatever, regardless of the starting point. Another example of how it transcends the individual level is what we see in cybersocial systems. This is a combination of groups of people, often diverse groups of people, and of digital systems which together perform a function, such as, in this case, a bank. We may think of a bank as being a physical thing, a building with bank written on the front of it, but in fact, a bank, like many of our institutions, doesn't produce anything physical. It's not a car factory which produces cars rolling off the production line. Everything which a bank does is actually information. Money is maybe sometimes represented in the form of coins and banknotes and chunks of gold, but money is actually a concept. It's actually a value indication, which is information. And everything which a bank does increasingly these days is done digitally, is done in the minds, in the information dimension of its employees. And the combination of those is that which produces the function, the services of a bank. Some consequences of emergent information theory. It has rather a lot, but I've chosen two which I think you may find the most interesting. And the first concerns perception. It's a difficult thing to depict. So I've done my best here. On the right-hand side, you see a person who is walking down a street, having a look at buildings, benches, trees. And on the left-hand side, you see what he is actually seeing. My point here is that in between the two, you see an eye and a bit of visual cortex or something. And what we actually see when we walk down the street is not and cannot be the physical world which we are walking through. The green color of those leaves is not something which exists in physical reality. All that exists there is a material which reflects a particular frequency of life. The greenness is a qualia. That is something which only exists in our information dimension. And that applies for everything which you see as you go about your daily life. The world you exist in, that you perceive around you, is a very good, a very accurate reconstruction of the physical world that your body inhabits. It's a good thing that it is, because otherwise you'd be continually bumping into things and mistaking things for something else. But it is a reconstruction, and it can only be a reconstruction because obviously our brains, they're stuck inside our skulls. They have no access to that outside world. The only thing that they can rely on is the photons, which in this case, in visual sense, strike your retina as a flat layer of information, go into your visual cortex, where it's reconstructed into this three-dimensional model of the world that we are working through. This may seem impossible in the sense that the world that we perceive is so big. That guy is looking out down the street, he's seeing a building which is many stories high, trees, benches. How can that possibly fit inside the 1.5 liters of your brain? And the answer to this, of course, is it doesn't. It doesn't have to. It's in your information dimension. It's not in your brain. And as we saw earlier in the topography example of the tesseract, a highly connected network can actually contain immensely more volume than the volume of the network itself. So there's absolutely no reason why something the size of your reconstruction of your surroundings should not fit within your information dimension. And that is what it does. It's just very difficult to see that way, because throughout evolution, obviously, our brains have been designed as the only way, but also a necessary way, of finding our way into our surroundings and creating that illusion that what we are perceiving is that which it's based on. We have nothing else, and it works pretty damn well. So try it. Next time you're walking down the street, look around you and just think, I'm walking through my own information dimension. Another one. This is a good one. Materialistic determinism and free will. Now, this thing here on the left obviously isn't anything to do with free will. It's a tornado. And in a tornado, if you want to understand, if you want to know why it is that a particular molecule, air molecule or whatever, or unit of air has the velocity and the direction that it has, is to look up a level, to look up at the processes, the physical process which is taking place at a higher level of organization. And this is something which, materialists, physical scientists don't really like, but it is, whether you like it or not, top-down causation. The position of a component part of this tornado is determined by the high-level system that it is a part of. And if we apply this to what we've been thinking about in terms of emergent information theory, then we see the same thing happening. When decision-making takes place in my brain, to say a particular word like decision-making, what actually happens is that it works down through the various layers of organization down to the neuronal level, and it actually causes my neurons to change their states in accordance with that decision. This does not mean that the informational forces neurons to do something which is counter to their physical nature, any more than the tornado can cause a molecule of air to do something which is contrary to its nature. What it does say is that at the neuronal level, the neuron doesn't really mind what it's caused to do from a higher level. It's just sitting there and it's doing its thing, and it's oblivious to that which it's a part of. But it is the higher level of organization that, through top-down causation, actually determines what happens at a lower level. So this tells us that free will is not actually an illusion in the sense that it is beyond materialistic determinism. It is not so that our decisions, as has often been claimed, are determined by what happens in our brains. It's exactly the other way around. What happens in our decisions determines what happens in our brains. What may be a little less a slightly less attractive conclusion of this is that it does not actually mean that our free will is free, because, as I mentioned earlier, what happens in the information dimension must be subject to its own physics, its own laws. If it wasn't, then nothing there which we would which would happen would have any structure or consistency or whatever else. In order to work, everything needs to be law-based. But it is the case that our decision making is independent of materialistic determinism. So, to wrap this up in 4 slides, every physical interaction creates a quirk, and this is a fundamental unit of information about the cause of the change which has taken place. And systems have evolved and been designed to exploit these quirks in various ways. They do this by combining quirks into stacked layers of organization where each level has its own emergent features. And this takes place in an emergent information dimension that is created by each of these information systems in order to house that which they have created. Really? Then it's quite simple. And I'm very interested in hearing what you have to say about emergent information theory. Thank you.